They sit in the corner at parties, nursing a glass of water while everyone else drowns their discomfort in wine. They're called boring, uptight, no fun. But Carl Jung discovered something that made his hands shake as he wrote his notes. The person who refuses the drink isn't missing out. They're guarding a psychological truth so powerful that society has to numb itself to avoid facing it. In a world where alcohol is the social glue that holds everything together, the sober person becomes dangerous. Not because of what they do, but because of what they see. And Jung realized that their refusal to drink wasn't about health or religion or personal preference. It was something far more terrifying. It was a rebellion against the collective unconscious itself. Jung called it spiritus contra spiritum, spirit against spirit. The battle between the counterfeit spirit in the bottle and the real spirit that demands to be found, and the person who chooses neither poison nor numbness. They've chosen the hardest path of all. They've chosen to stay awake in a sleeping world. Let me tell you what Jung discovered about people who don't drink, and why their sobriety is the most dangerous power move in modern society. Consider the famous case of an American businessman, Rowland H., who came to Jung in 1931. He was outwardly accomplished, but inwardly destroyed by alcohol. This real patient would change history. He'd tried everything, every treatment, every promise, every fresh start. Nothing worked. Jung spent months in deep analytical work, dream analysis, exploring the unconscious territories, and temporary sobriety was achieved. Rowland left believing he was cured, but 6 months later, the pattern repeated. The alcohol returned with a vengeance. When Rowland returned to Jung's office, Jung delivered an insight that would reshape our understanding of addiction entirely. He told him his case was medically hopeless from a conventional standpoint, that psychiatry alone could not save him, that his only chance was what Jung called a vital spiritual experience, something powerful enough to reorganize the entire personality structure. Jung was saying that the craving for alcohol wasn't a disease of the body, it was a disease of the soul, a misdirected search for God, a thirst for wholeness that had found the wrong well. This clinical insight became the foundation for what would later evolve into Alcoholics Anonymous. Rowland joined a spiritual fellowship called the Oxford Group. He found sobriety. He passed the message to another alcoholic named Ebby Thatcher, who passed it to Bill Wilson, the co-founder of AA. The entire 12-step movement traces back to Jung's terrifying insight delivered to one desperate patient, the recognition that treating alcoholism required addressing spiritual emptiness, not just physical dependency, that the craving for spirits was actually a craving for spirit, with a capital S. The person who doesn't drink has recognized this truth. They're searching for that spirit directly, without the counterfeit, without the numbing agent, without the escape route that society offers at every corner. But here's what makes this dangerous. Society needs alcohol, not because everyone's an alcoholic, but because reality is harsh. Life is brutal. Consciousness hurts. And alcohol provides the socially acceptable way to turn down the volume, to blur the edges, to make small talk, bearable and awkward silences tolerable, and existential dread manageable. The person who refuses this deal isn't just different. They're a walking reminder that the deal exists, that everyone else is trading awareness for comfort, that the emperor has no clothes and everyone agreed not to mention it. Jung understood this at a molecular level. In his famous 1961 letter to Bill Wilson, he explained that alcohol in Latin is spiritus, the same word used for the highest religious experience and the most depraving poison. This wasn't linguistic coincidence, it was psychological revelation. Jung wrote, "The helpful formula therefore is spiritus contra spiritum, spirit against spirit, Humans are spiritual beings having a material experience. And when that spiritual hunger goes unfed, they'll drink spirits instead. They'll seek transcendence in a bottle. They'll trade genuine connection for chemical companionship. They'll choose the path of least resistance, even when that path leads to destruction. The non-drinker has chosen not to fill that hunger with poison, which means they have to face it directly, every single day. Every social situation where everyone else is 3 drinks in and they're stone sober. Every moment of discomfort that others are drowning in wine while they're feeling every sharp edge of reality. This is why Jung considered conscious sobriety to be one of the most demanding psychological achievements possible. Not because it requires willpower, but because it requires staying present with the full weight of human existence without an escape hatch. But not all non-drinkers are created equal. If we apply Jung's insights on the shadow and repression to modern social dynamics, 3 distinct psychological profiles emerge. Not all sobriety comes from the same place, and understanding these types reveals everything about consciousness, shadow, and the terrible burden of being fully awake. The first type is dominated by what Jung called the shadow. We can call this the repressed shadow profile. This is the person who cannot drink, because if they do, something terrible gets loose. They know themselves well enough to understand that alcohol removes the locks on doors that must stay closed. Their shadow is too dangerous, their rage too close to the surface, their capacity for destruction too real. We see this dynamic clearly in individuals who maintain rigid sobriety, not because they've transcended the need for escape, but because they fear what they might become without their defenses. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The Alchemist's Path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. They're holding the wolf by the ears. They can't let go, but they can't hold on forever either. Jung observed that these people often display what he called reaction formation, a defense mechanism where you become the opposite of what you fear. They become militantly anti-alcohol, judgmental of drinkers, moralistic about sobriety. Because every person who drinks represents the temptation they're fighting every single day, the shadow they refuse to integrate. The clinical pattern reveals itself through their language. They don't say, "I choose not to drink." They say, "I can't drink." That word, "can't," tells you everything. It reveals the internal tyrant, the shadow locked in the basement, the part of themselves they've exiled rather than integrated. The danger here is profound. Jung taught that unlived life doesn't disappear. It accumulates pressure. It builds force. It waits for the moment when the defenses crack. And the person who has never faced their shadow while sober will eventually face it in some other form. The rage finds another outlet. Maybe it becomes passive aggression. Maybe it becomes bitter judgment. Maybe it becomes chronic depression. The chaos manifests differently. The wolf finds another way out. Because you can't kill the shadow. You can only integrate it or be controlled by it. These individuals often end up in what Jung called the inflation trap, identifying so completely with their moral superiority about sobriety that they lose touch with their own humanity. They forget that the capacity for addiction, for escape, for self-destruction lives in every human being, including them. And when they forget this, they become dangerous in a different way, not through drinking, but through self-righteousness, through judgment, through the unconscious cruelty of people who believe they've transcended what they've actually just repressed. The second type corresponds to high sensitivity and hypervigilance. We call this the traumatized observer. These are the people whose perceptive abilities are so heightened that alcohol represents a threat to their survival system. They've learned to see everything, to read micro-expressions before the person making them is aware, to sense danger before it fully materializes, to predict patterns that others miss entirely. Alcohol would lower these defenses, and they cannot afford to lower these defenses, not because they're paranoid, but because their trauma taught them that missing a signal could be fatal, that letting their guard down meant getting hurt, that staying hypervigilant was the only way to stay safe. Jung recognized patterns like this across multiple clinical presentations. These individuals described alcohol as terrifying, not because of what it does to the body, but because of what it does to awareness. It blurs the edges they need sharp. It softens the boundaries they need firm. It creates the vulnerability they spent years learning to avoid. To them, the drunk person is incomprehensible. Someone who has voluntarily disabled their threat detection system, who has chosen temporary blindness in a world where seeing clearly is survival, who has traded safety for social acceptance. These non-drinkers aren't refusing pleasure, they're refusing what they perceive as danger. And this creates a fascinating dynamic in social situations. While everyone else is getting looser, more relaxed, more open, the traumatized observer is getting more tense, because now they're the only one watching, the only one tracking the changing dynamics, the only one noticing when someone's speech changes, or when the energy in the room shifts, or when boundaries start dissolving. What makes this type dangerous to others is their clarity. They see things drunk people miss. They notice contradictions. They detect lies that social lubrication is supposed to hide. They sense the shadow content that 3 drinks is supposed to make ignorable, and their presence makes drinkers deeply uncomfortable, because suddenly the cover is blown. The agreed-upon social trance is disrupted. Someone is watching who isn't participating in the collective dimming of awareness. These individuals often report feeling like anthropologists studying a foreign culture when they're in drinking environments. They see the rituals, the bonding patterns, the way alcohol facilitates disclosure and creates artificial intimacy. And they see how fragile all of it is, how it evaporates the next morning when everyone's sober again and pretending they don't remember what they said. This type of non-drinker has learned something crucial about human consciousness. They've learned that most people can only tolerate authenticity when they're somewhat unconscious. That vulnerability requires lubricant. That truth needs to be softened before it can be spoken. And they've chosen to stay conscious anyway, to be the one person in the room who's tracking reality while everyone else is negotiating their relationship with it. The third type embodies the highest aim of Jungian psychology: individuation. We call this the conscious warrior. This is the integrated non-drinker, the person who has faced their shadow, metabolized their trauma, and made a conscious choice that reality, no matter how painful, is the only path to wholeness. They don't avoid alcohol out of fear. They don't avoid it out of repressed rage. They avoid it out of clarity, out of hard-won wisdom, out of the recognition that consciousness is the only real currency in a human life. These individuals represent what Jung considered the goal of the individuation process, becoming who you actually are rather than who your conditioning says you should be. They've done the terrifying work of shadow integration while sober. They know their capacity for destruction, for selfishness, for cruelty. They've looked at it directly without flinching or fleeing, and they've chosen consciousness over comfort anyway. Jung observed that these people possess what he called the transcendent function, the ability to hold the tension between opposites without seeking escape, to feel the full weight of existence without numbing it, to stay present with suffering without making it worse through avoidance. This is not repression. This is integration. The conscious warrior knows that the urge to escape is human, that the desire for numbness is natural, that the pull toward oblivion makes complete sense. They simply understand that giving in to that pull trades temporary relief for permanent unconsciousness. A narrative illustration of this: type, imagine someone who spent years drinking socially, heavily, habitually. Who knew what alcohol offered? The softening of edges, the artificial confidence, the easy camaraderie. But at some point, they recognized what it cost. The mornings lost to fog, the conversations they couldn't quite remember, the slow erosion of their ability to feel their own feelings without chemical mediation. And they made a choice, not to never drink again out of fear, but to reclaim consciousness, to be fully present for their own life, to feel everything without a buffer. These are the non-drinkers who terrify the drinking world most, because they're not bitter, they're not judgmental. They're not white-knuckling through life pretending they don't feel the pull. They've simply found something more valuable than escape. They've found presence, reality, God, wholeness, the actual spirit that the bottle only mimics. And their existence is a challenge to everyone who chose differently, a living example that consciousness is possible, that presence is achievable, that you don't have to drown your awareness to survive being human. Here's where Jung's insight becomes truly dangerous. He discovered that non-drinkers trigger something in drinkers that has nothing to do with the drink itself. They trigger shadow projection. The sober person becomes a mirror, reflecting back everything the drinker doesn't want to see about their own relationship with consciousness. When someone who drinks regularly encounters someone who doesn't, a psychological mechanism activates automatically. The drinker must explain the non-drinker, must categorize them, must make sense of why someone would refuse what seems so obviously necessary for social functioning, and the explanations reveal the drinker's shadow. They call the non-drinker boring, uptight, self-righteous, no fun, missing, out, afraid of life. These aren't observations, they're projections. The boring accusation means the drinker fears they're boring without alcohol. The uptight accusation means the drinker fears their own rigidity when sober. The self-righteous accusation means the drinker feels judged by their own choices. The no fun accusation means the drinker has forgotten how to access joy without chemical assistance. Jung documented this pattern of projection and scapegoating repeatedly across clinical observations. The stronger the reaction to someone else's sobriety, the more unconscious the person is about their own relationship with alcohol. The anger isn't about the non-drinker, it's about the mirror they provide. Consider the psychology of what's actually happening in these moments. The sober person isn't doing anything. They're simply existing in their choice. But that choice forces everyone around them to confront their own choice, to see that drinking isn't inevitable, isn't required, isn't the only way to navigate social situations. And for many people, that realization is intolerable. Because if sobriety is possible, then their drinking is a choice. And if it's a choice, then they're responsible for it. And if they're responsible for it, they have to examine why they're making it. Most people aren't ready for that examination. This creates a dynamic Jung understood well: projection and scapegoating. The sober person becomes the problem in social groups, not because they're causing problems, but because they're revealing problems that were always there. Their presence makes visible the collective agreement to stay unconscious, and groups defend their unconsciousness viciously. Jung observed that cultures organized around alcohol consumption cannot tolerate full consciousness in their midst. The sober person represents a threat to the collective trance. They're breaking the unspoken agreement. They're refusing to participate in the shared dimming of awareness, and the collective will push them out, mock them, pressure them, or simply exclude them to maintain the agreement. This is why sobriety is lonely, not because sober people can't connect, but because connection in a drinking culture often requires participating in collective unconsciousness, and the person who refuses to participate gets isolated for their refusal. The mechanism works like this. At a party, everyone's a few drinks in. The conversation gets louder, more animated. less filtered. Intimacy blooms artificially. Barriers drop, and the sober person is watching all of it. They're seeing the slurred words, the repeated stories, the gradual loss of coherence. They're not judging it, but they're seeing it clearly, and that clarity makes drunk people uncomfortable, because they can sense they're being seen, really seen, without the mutual agreement to pretend everyone's more charming and clever than they actually are. So the drunk people start explaining the sober person. Oh, they don't drink. They're really serious, kind of intense. And with those words, they've created separation. They've made the sober person the other, the one who doesn't belong to the club, the outsider. But Jung discovered something even more profound about the psychology of sobriety. He called it the alchemical transformation. The process of staying conscious while everyone around you seeks unconsciousness creates psychological pressure so intense that it forges something diamond hard in the personality. Alchemy, in Jung's framework, wasn't about turning lead into gold literally. It was about psychological transformation, the creation of the philosopher's stone, the integration of opposites, the birth of the self from the raw material of the ego. And sobriety, conscious sobriety, is an alchemical process. Because every moment you don't drink when everyone else is drinking, you're holding the tension of opposites. You're feeling the pull toward escape while choosing presence. You're experiencing the urge toward unconsciousness while maintaining awareness. You're sitting with discomfort while watching everyone else dissolve theirs chemically. This creates what Jung, quoting the alchemists, called the vas hermeticum, or sealed vessel, the container where transformation happens because the pressure is not allowed to escape. You're not letting the tension release through the usual valve. You're holding it, containing it, letting it build. And that holding, that conscious endurance of difficulty, creates psychological gold. Jung wrote extensively about this in his work on individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are rather than who society needs you to be. And individuation requires holding tension, staying with discomfort, refusing the easy path, choosing consciousness even when consciousness hurts. The non-drinker who has integrated their shadow isn't missing out on life. They're living more fully than the person who needs to blur reality to tolerate it. They're experiencing the full spectrum of human emotion without chemical mediation. They're present for their own existence in a way that perpetual mild intoxication prevents. Think about what happens in the brain during this process. While everyone else is dampening their neural activity, softening their responses, the sober person is processing everything at full intensity. They're feeling their social anxiety without numbing it. They're experiencing their discomfort without medicating it. They're sitting with their awkwardness without dissolving it. And over time, this builds psychological muscle, the capacity to be with difficulty without needing to escape it, and the ability to feel uncomfortable emotions without reacting to them, the strength to maintain presence even when presence is painful. This is the terrifying truth Jung discovered. Sobriety isn't deprivation, it's liberation, but it's a liberation that most people aren't ready for, because it requires facing everything you've been avoiding, feeling everything you've been numbing, seeing everything you've been blurring. The sober person has chosen the hardest path, the path without shortcuts, the path without easy outs, the path that demands they show up fully for every moment of their existence. And that choice transforms them into something the drinking world can barely recognize. They become what Jung called the individuated person, the one who has integrated their shadow, the one who can hold their own darkness without acting it out, the one who has found the actual spirit that alcohol only mimics. And this is why Jung considered sobriety in a drinking culture to be one of the most powerful psychological achievements possible. Not because alcohol is evil, it's not. Not because drinking is wrong, it isn't. but because choosing consciousness over comfort, presence over numbness, reality over illusion requires a strength that most people never develop. The non-drinker isn't better than the drinker. They've simply made a different choice, a harder choice, a choice that society doesn't support and often actively opposes. And making that choice, maintaining that choice, living that choice every single day transforms the personality in ways that occasional drinkers and social drinkers and habitual drinkers will never experience. Because transformation requires pressure, and pressure requires a sealed container. And the sober person in a drinking world has created the perfect conditions for alchemical change. They're turning the lead of ordinary consciousness into the gold of awakened presence. They're finding the spirit that the bottle promised but could never deliver. They're becoming whole in a fragmented world, conscious in a sleeping society, awake when everyone else has chosen to dream. This is what Jung discovered about people who don't drink. They're not missing out. They're the only ones who are fully present. They're not boring. They're the only ones sober enough to see how bizarre the drinking rituals actually are. They're not uptight. They're the only ones integrated enough to hold their shadow without needing chemical assistance. The person who doesn't drink has made the ultimate power move. They've refused the deal society offers. They've rejected the trade of awareness for comfort. They've chosen to stay awake in a sleeping world. And that choice, that terrifying choice, is the beginning of everything Jung called individuation. You want to know the real secret? The one Jung understood at the deepest level? The craving for alcohol is a low-level spiritual craving, and the person who doesn't drink is simply cutting out the middleman. They're going straight to the source, seeking the actual spirit, the real connection, the genuine wholeness that alcohol promises but can never deliver. Spiritus contra spiritum, spirit against spirit. The battle isn't between sobriety and intoxication. It's between fake transcendence and real transformation, between temporary escape and permanent presence, between the counterfeit spirit and the genuine article. And the person who chooses not to drink has chosen reality, has chosen consciousness, has chosen to face the full weight of existence without an escape hatch. That choice is terrifying. That choice is lonely. That choice is the hardest thing you can do in a culture that offers numbness at every turn. But that choice is also freedom, real freedom. Not the fake freedom of I can do whatever I want, but the real freedom of I am fully present for my own life. I see clearly. I feel completely. I show up authentically. I am awake. And being awake in a sleeping world is the most dangerous thing you can be, because your presence challenges everyone else's choice to stay unconscious. Your clarity exposes everyone else's blur. Your integration reveals everyone else's fragmentation. The non-drinker isn't better than anyone else. They've simply chosen a path that most people aren't willing to walk, a path without easy outs, a path that demands everything, a path that transforms you into something society doesn't quite know what to do with. Someone who sees everything, feels everything, knows everything, without the numbing agent, without the social lubricant, without the excuse. Someone who has learned to hold the tension of being human without seeking escape, who has integrated their shadow without acting it out, who has found the spirit without drinking it. That person is dangerous, not because they'll hurt you, but because they'll remind you of everything you're avoiding, everything you're numbing, everything you're refusing to face, and maybe, just maybe, they'll inspire you to make the same terrifying choice, to put down the glass, to face reality, to choose consciousness, to seek the real spirit instead of the counterfeit, to join the rebellion against the collective unconscious, to stay awake in the sleeping world, to become the person Jung believed we're all capable of becoming, fully conscious, fully present. fully alive, without needing to dull a single edge to survive being human. That's the psychology of people who don't drink. That's Jung's most dangerous discovery. That's the truth the drinking world doesn't want you to know. Sobriety isn't missing out. It's the only way to fully show up, and showing up fully, consciously, presently, in a world that encourages constant escape. That's the ultimate power move. If you recognize yourself in this, if you've chosen consciousness over comfort, write in the comments, "I choose reality." Because that choice changes everything. That choice is the beginning of the alchemical transformation. That choice is the first step on the path to becoming who you actually are. See you in the next dimension. In the alchemist's path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get the Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.